Going to get started. I call this meeting of the Red Oak Independent School District to order at 6:30 p.m. Let the record show that a quorum of board members is present, that this meeting has been duly called, and that notice of the meeting has been posted in accordance with the Texas Open Meetings Act, Texas Government Code, Chapter 551. All board members are present with the exception of John Anderson and Sean Kelly. Mr. Knight, would you give us the invocation?
Father, as we come together right now, we just ask that you be with us as we go through and make decisions, Father, and have an understanding, the things that are best for this district, this area, everyone involved in our school district and our community. Let us listen with open ears and make best decisions as possible, Father. Thank you for everything, Lord Jesus. Amen.
Amen. Mr. Sebring, would you lead us in the pledges?
I can. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Honor to the Texas flag. I pledge allegiance to thee, Texas, one state, under God, one and indivisible.
Okay, at this time, we will open our public hearing for the purpose of discussing budget and proposed tax rate for the fiscal year 2024-2025. Dr. Bill Johnson.
Thank you. And good evening. The state law requires that we have a public hearing before we adopt the budget, or before y'all, the board, adopts the budget, and then also before the tax rate. We won't adopt the tax rate until August or September, so there'll be another public hearing. And so we'll just do this so the community has more information on the budget than what y'all may have. This evening, just going to go briefly through the budget development process, then show you components of the budget to be adopted this year. Then I'm going to talk briefly also a little bit about the property values. I already did that in May, but some numbers have changed, and I just wanted to keep y'all abreast of that. And then talk about the next steps, and then answer any questions you may have. Yet, as usual, our budget supports the commitments, vision, and mission of the strategic plan, prepared in accordance with district policy as well as TEA requirements. And we've reviewed all the components of the revenue as well as the expenditures to ensure that they're as up to date as possible as we project from current year to the next year. We started in January with showing the Board of Education the timeline for the different components of the budget adoption process. We met with all budget managers in February to go over expectations for this year. We also asked them to put all their budgets into the Skyward for us in the month of March and early April. And then one of the components that's unique for this next year is that in order to help us balance the budget, we decreased all the campus allocation and all the department allocations by 10% so we could have a balanced budget. A lot of districts in the state of Texas right now won't be adopting a balanced budget, but fortunately for us, we have the resources to adopt a balanced budget. Again, we received at the end of April the preliminary property values from the county appraisal district. They initially had an 18.67 increase in the certified values. Just as FYI, and I'll show you a slide later on, that's not really based on homesteads and residences, based more on commercial property. I don't want people to think that pricing of the value of houses is going up by 18.67%. So that's the initial projection. They estimated it to be a net of 15.1%. We'll get that number at the end of July. And as you'll see in a few minutes, I've even lowered that a little bit more just to be cautious. Again, we provided a budget update on May 13th to the board. And the tax rate, even though we can't adopt it right now, we pretty much know what our tax rate is. The state doesn't, it requires you to wait until August because back in 2019, they implemented some procedures that if your tax rate goes up by more than 2.5%, your tax rate goes down. Fortunately or unfortunately for us, we're at the very bottom anyway, so it can't adjust any more than already is. So we're budgeting everything based on a 0.7552 M&O tax rate, and then the INS tax rate has remained the same for the last several years at 0.3481. And again, we'll get the final numbers in July, and we'll let TA know what those numbers for this year are, so they'll finalize the tax rates for next year at the end of July. We talked about this in the May meeting. We're decreasing our ADA projection by 25 students based on lower than anticipated enrollment from this year. And we've increased all of the enrichment categories by 3% based on what was budgeted this year, because most of those are actual ADA for those enrichment categories like special education, bilingual, comp ed. They came in pretty close to what was budgeted, so we just have bumped those up by 3% as well for next year. The basic allotment remains the same at 6160. It's been that way for a number of years. And the school safety allotment is $10 per ADA, plus a couple of years ago they added $15,000 per campus. Again, that's to help offset the requirement of police officers at every campus. We were already there, so it's not negatively impacting us, because the $15,000 per campus won't provide much resources for that. Again, I have it on the bottom there of the slide. It only went up 28 cents from $9.72 to $10 per ADA, so they didn't increase it very much when they did that. Again, I budgeted 12.5% for the frozen taxable certified values. Again, the CAD said around 15% is what they thought it was going to be, so I loaded a little bit. Again, it's based on that 7,552 tax rate. Again, that's including the $100,000 homestead exemption and the compression. We got some compression this year on the over 65, which I'll share a little bit more in a few minutes. And then there's the compression will continue moving forward if tax rates go down. We're also eligible for the fast growth allotment. We've done that for the last several years. It says if you grow to more than 250 students over a 6-year period, then they give you additional funding. And we're going to get roughly $400,000 as part of our state funding model for our growth. So we are a growing district. Also, we're projecting a little bit more state pension payments. They usually offset the cost that we have to pay for pension. We also slightly increase the Medicaid reimbursement because our student special education student population is increasing, and those eligible for Medicaid is also increasing. Projected increase in some of the funds related to indirect costs, charged to federal grants, that's gone up slightly. And then also interest earnings, interest rates have gone up. So we can hopefully project more interest earnings this year than what we would have normally projected for interest growth. Again, we've also shared this, the main meeting. Teacher salary scale will increase by $1,000 per step. Auxiliary and paraprofessional staff will get a 5% raise of the midpoint, and administrative and professional staff will get 3% of the midpoint, and we'll continue to review plans to ensure that all pay grades are competitive if something unusual comes up. Also on the expenditure side, again, as I said, we reduced the campus and department budgets by 10%. We've added a few positions due to the increase in students and expansion of the required instructional programs, mainly a kindergarten teacher, some special ed staff, secondary instructional programs. One of the things also is when ESSER 3 funds were available, those have gone away now. And so there have been identified roughly 6 positions that felt needed to stay within the district. And so those are being funded by the general fund this year. Some of those have been transferred over to other federal grants, but not all of them will be able to be paid for by the other federal grants. So the district is picking up those costs. Our property and liability insurance has increased, and that's on the agenda for later tonight. I had initially budgeted $150,000. It came in at $180,000. So it wasn't only a $30,000 difference, which wasn't too bad. And then over the last several years, we've had some attendance incentives for certain employee groups, and those are still budgeted and hopefully will remain because that helped us make sure staff came to work every day. And so the budget for adoption. Again, the total budget is roughly $97.5 million for all three funds. The state requires that the board approve the general fund, student nutrition, and debt service funds. And as well, I'm going to go through each of those, but the general fund is balanced. Again, not a lot of districts probably will have a balanced budget for the general fund. Student nutrition, we've over the last several years, we've had to spend more than we were receiving. I'll talk about that in a minute. And then our debt service fund too, it's that way. So in the general fund, here's the revenues for the general fund. Proposed budget this year compared to last year. And the main growth in our revenue is from the state. And again, that's because tax values have gone down over the last several years. And that property value study, the state comptroller's values have gone down from what was projected to the actual number, I should say, what was initially projected for next year to what we're currently projecting for next year. So roughly on the general fund side, $3.6 million increase in the budget. And on the expenditure side, again, the majority of the increase is going to be payroll costs. And so because of that 10% reduction in each campus and department budgets, some of those other categories have been reduced because of that. So again, it's the same 3.6, so we have a balanced budget on the general fund side. And here's more of the functions, and the main function increase, as you would expect, would be the instruction. That's where the majority of the staffing and the funds go to for the instruction of the students. And then here's a chart, and it's pretty interesting that our components haven't changed much over the last 3 or 4 years. We get 50% of our funding from the foundation school plan. That's the program for the state. We get 38 to 39, or roughly 39% from local taxes. So we're still viewed as more of a unwealthy school district, because if your property tax revenue is higher than your state funding, then you're viewed more as a wealthy district. So we're still on the lower side because the local tax is only being 39% of our general fund. And on the expenditure side, salaries are roughly 85.6%. That's typically from 75 to 90% is where salaries should be. It'd be nice if it was closer to 80%. Because one of the things, if you have to reduce your budget, you only have, 14% of your budget other than staffing that you could reduce, which is going to be very difficult to do. And it's easier to say, okay, I can do 5 staff members and save $400,000, $500,000. So that's why maybe see some of these districts laying off staff, because it's easier to balance a budget by reducing staff, because that's such a high component of the general fund budget. And then on the function side, again, the majority of it is instructional related, and I have a slide here in a minute to help document that as well. And then a fund balance. The state requires or says you should have roughly 25%. Our policy, we changed it. It used to be a lot lower than that. It used to only be 15%. And back in 21-22, we increased it to 25%. Thus, the green and the pink lines now match. And our fund balance is roughly around 28%. That's what's projected for this year. Again, some of that's going to be dependent on how the 23-24 year ends. But right now, I'm still projecting a positive variance there, but we still have a few more weeks to find out. And then here's a chart that I've used from time to time to show where a dollar goes. And roughly 77 cents goes directly towards educating students, with 71 spent on teaching, transporting, supervising, and counseling students, 6% for materials, then 13 cents goes towards securing, operating, and maintaining the facilities, and 10 cents goes towards the central office in community services. So roughly 77. So the majority of the budget is spent directly on students where it should be. So on the student nutrition side, again, back when COVID first hit, the federal government gave a lot more revenue to help offset the cost. And again, all students ate free for a while too. And so that built up the revenue stream, and the state requires that you can't have a high fund balance in the student nutrition fund. So last year and this year, we're budgeting to help upgrade and replace kitchen equipment and cafeteria equipment. So that's why the additional $1 billion is budgeted for that to take place in this year's budget. But we have to get below that 25% for the fund balance. That's what's required. But since these are federal funds, the state doesn't want you to have high fund balance. Again, that could look negative to the community if you're charging students for lunch, but then having a high fund balance associated with it. And again, unlike the general fund, salary and benefits are only around 43%, and the majority of the budget is spent on buying the food and preparing the food for the students and serving the food for lunch. On the debt service side, again, the budget is roughly the same as last year. One of the things we're going to do this year too is over the last several years we've been able to pay off prior bonds. We did 2013 bonds, 2014 bonds, so we're projecting to do 2015 bonds, which is going to it's about $5.5 million for to pay off the bond, which we have sufficient funds to do that. It's also going to keep us from having to pay roughly $950,000 of future interest earnings, or interest payments, I should say, not earnings, interest payments. So again, the goal is to keep us down to where we're not having to increase the debt service tax rate. Then the fund balance for the debt service, it went up the last several years due to the increase in property values, but this year it's going to go back down to be at $8.7 million. Then now a few additional items that just is good information for individuals to have. Again, the basic allotment, it's been at 6160 for, this will be the 6th year in a row. And if they, everybody's trying to get the state to do some sort of consumer price index component, that if consumer price index goes up 3% from year over year, then the 6160 needs to increase. So over the last 6 years, it's gone up by 19%, which would have been roughly $1,100 more dollars, which would have been almost $9 million more dollars this year in our budget than we have. That would have helped us do a lot of things for the community. Then the enrollment, as you see the enrollment gone up the last several years, we thought it was going to be at 6,800 in the 23-24, but it wasn't. It was only around 6,600. So we're still projecting to go up over the next year. Then maybe settle, that's being conservative, kind of level out for a few years. But each year we'll get a different demographic study, which may change some of that. And again, with a lot of different residential areas coming in, and student population is going to increase. Then we have the average daily attendance. That is what's used to provide the funding. And basically it's your enrollment minus your pre-kindergarten students and half of your kindergarten students. So it's not a 1-for-1. And so we're projecting, this last year we projected 6,350. We only had roughly 6,100 at the end of the year, but we're projecting 6,325 for next year. That's what the budget's based on. Then you have the weighted average daily attendance, and that's taking all of the basic allotment and all the special allocations and dividing that by 6160. Says that if we took the top dollar amount less 6160, then the weighted daily attendance would have been 89, or projected to be 8956. That's really not our attendance. That's just taking all the funding that the state gives divided by that 6160, which is basic allotment. Then in using that higher number, it says that our revenue per watt is only $7,600. The actual number of total students divided by the budget projection for next year roughly our total per student cost or or per student cost is $10,800. So there have been some people says between 12,000 to 13,000 per student is what school districts get. We only get 10,800 is what's projected for next year for each student. Then taxable values, these are there's two different columns. There's the M&O and INS, and the reason that is for us, because we had a Chapter 313 agreement with Triumph in place, and so they're not taxed on the M&O side, but they're taxed at 100% on the INS. So that was two separate tax values. Over the last 5 years, that hadn't come into play, and this is the last year for that. So moving forward, we'll be able to show only one tax value for both M&O and INS. But I just left it this way because that's the way it's been over the last 4, 5, 6 years. Then on the estimated tax revenue, this is the calculation to come up with the tax levy that we're projecting. And you see the top line taxable values, $4.3 billion. Then there's the frozen amount, which is reduced. So what we're taxed, that we're able to tax on is at $3.7 billion. Then another number that's interesting is that frozen, which is in the middle, $2.3 million. That used to be over $4 million. Those are actual tax dollars the district gets. But because of the over 65 compression, that went down in half this year. And I have a slide here to show you in a minute, which negatively impacted our budget projections as well as our tax projections, because we didn't get that information when we got the certified values in the end of July. So here's the tax collection history. And as you see, it's roughly 99%, close to 99% for the last 4 years. This year, based on what we thought it was going to be based on the July certified values, we're only going to be at 91% collections. So we're going to be about $2 million less in tax collections. So if we would have gotten the right numbers up front and budgeted with that $2 million less, then we'd have roughly 99% collections. So we're still roughly at the 99% collections of what's tax bills that have gone out. We get 99% collected of all the tax bills. And then here's the tax rate for the M&O. And little top at the top, about 35% has been dropped over the last 6 years, which is a significant tax rate decrease. 41 cents, it's gone down. Then here's a total with both the M&O and the INS tax rates over the last 15 years. And now here's what we got for tax year 2023. This is the top 10 taxpayers. There's several on here that have not been on there in the past. The first one, Compass Data Centers, 3A, that wasn't in the top 10 last year. CZGA 1, LLC, TCF, Red Oak, those weren't on there last year. So that's where most of the increase in the tax values are, I would say, are coming from, more commercial than residential. So just don't want the homeowners to think that their market values and taxable values are really skyrocketing at the 18%, which is what the CAD said. It's more the commercial. Again, just briefly talk about the property values. Again, the first rating requires that you share with the board the property value study as well as the taxes. And again, as I shared back in May, we estimate what that's going to be and we budget based on that. Then if the comptroller comes in with a higher value than what you budgeted, then they say you get less state funding. But you as a district don't have the ability to go back and collect more taxes as a result of that. So you're in a negative situation. Fortunately for us, as you see, the green line is what the property values are, the green star. The blue star is what the property value studies have come in. As you see, over the last 4 years, they've been less than our taxable values, which is beneficial to us. The only downside is if you budget projecting one number, but then the comptroller comes in for the higher number, then you may lose some of the funding. Fortunately for us, when we were here in May, on the 23-24 number, we were projecting 3.586 billion. We protested what the comptroller had, and they agreed to this number, 3.581, so it went down, which gave us a little more revenue on the general fund side. So now the next steps is ask the board to adopt the budget tonight. We'll continue to monitor current year budget and actual revenues, because we'll come back in August with the tax rate, and if things need to change, we may have a budget amendment then. Again, adopt the tax rate in August, monitor the activity related to any changes in the state budget, which may negatively impact the funding, and we'll continue to review current programs. So that's it.
It's good information.
Any questions?
Debbie, did we have anybody signed up? Okay. Well,
Thank you.
then, thank you, Dr. Johnson.
Thank you, sir.
We don't vote on this now. And do we have any reason to go into closed?
We do not.
Okay, well then, if there's no one here to speak, this meeting is adjourned.
Doesn't mean